In December of 1998, Pokemon cards hit America like a ton of bricks. No matter where you looked, people were just trying to find any store so they could get their hands on these booster packs and try to pull out their favorite cards, whether it be Venusaur, Blastoise, and of course, good old Charizard. People were going nuts over these things. Over the past 14 years though, these cards have changed quite a bit. Sometimes we might wonder, how did we go from this to this? So, strap up, we're going to take a trip down memory lane and find out how Pokemon cards have changed over the years. When things were just starting out, Pokemon cards were pretty simple. I mean, if you take a look at some of the things that were considered powerful back then, just take a look at things like Hitmonchan, that do 20 damage for 1 energy. This was considered one of the strongest cards during its era. Just 1 energy, 20 damage. Pretty simple. Stuff like Electabuzz, also pretty powerful. It can do 30 damage or 40 if you flip a heads, for just 2 energy. So back then, Pokemon cards were actually fairly weak. They didn't do much damage, they didn't have a ton of hit points, and they just kind of kept the game simple. Of course, there were exceptions to this. You know, things like Charizard had 120 hit points. It could dish out a massive 100 damage. But these sorts of things were kept in check by the fact that their energy costs were so high, and they also had some stupid restriction that held them back. For example, Charizard makes you discard energy cards. So these cards were never really that good because there was just too much going against them, and you were pretty much just better off using the simpler cards like Hitmonchan. As more sets came out, we had things like Scyther that continued the trend of just basic Pokemon being the strongest. But still, strongest is a pretty relative term when you're thinking about just doing 30 damage for 3 energy. A card like Wigglytuff would come out and start to make evolutions more of a threat with its Do the Wave attack. This was considered one of the strongest attacks in the game. You could do 60 damage for 3 energy. That is pretty darn strong for the times. There's also something like Clefable that could use Metronome and copy your opponent's attack. And these were just kind of the only playable evolution cards when they first came out. The game was dominated by quick, hard-hitting, dinky little attackers like Electabuzz and Hitmonchan. And you know what? For a while, that's just kind of how it stayed. Some cards were so bad that they were laughable. For example, the Kabutops from Fossil is notoriously one of the worst cards ever printed. For 4 energy, 4 fighting energy mind you, it does a total of 40 damage. And for a Stage 2 Pokemon, which means you have to evolve it twice before you can get him into play, you have 60 hit points. So it definitely seemed like the creators of the game were trying to shift everybody away from the evolutions and just towards the simple basic Pokemon. Cards like Dark Flareon only had 50 hit points when you evolved into them. These were pretty sad. So for the most part, Pokemon was pretty simple. You just hit with your basic Pokemon. They do little amounts of damage, but it's just enough to kind of overwhelm your opponent early on. Now, as Generation 1 came to a close, some strong cards started to get printed. Things like Blaine's Arcanine, which could do a whopping 120 damage. And we also had Rocket Zapdos, which could do 70 damage as well. But these cards were kept in check by their low hit points. Blaine's Arcanine only had 90, Rocket Zapdos had 70, and by the fact that they had ridiculous drawbacks on their attacks as well. Blaine's Arcanine forced you to discard a bunch of energy, and Rocket Zapdos hurt itself quite a bit. So even though cards were getting stronger at this point, there were still restrictions that made them not as powerful as they could be. So the first generation of Pokemon were really kind of weak, but for those standards, I mean, it was perfectly fine. They were the beginning generation of Pokemon. There was no standard to go off of, so this is all we knew. We knew Hitmonchan good, Charizard bad, even though, sorry guys, Charizard was cool, but in competitive play, he didn't cut it. So Generation 1, simple and straightforward. That's really the definition of this era of Pokemon. However, things started to change with the next block. When Neo Genesis came out in December of 2000, the second generation of Pokemon was ushered in to the Pokemon TCG. Cards, they got a little stronger. Overall, things didn't get too out of control, but there were definitely some improvements in the Pokemon area. For example, a card like Sneasel could pretty much just beat up everything, with its attack aptly named Beat Up. For 2 Dark Energy, which was a brand new type introduced along with Metal in this set, could flip a coin for each Pokemon you have in play, and for each heads you do 20 damage. Now, if you compare this attack to something like Hitmonchan that was big in the first set, it's not even close. For just 2 energy, you could hit, like 120 damage if you flip 6 heads. On average, you're going to do about 60 damage, but if you factor in the special Darkness Energy that adds 10 more damage to your attack, Sneasel all of a sudden is doing 70, 80 damage just for 2 energy, which is a really big difference if you remember that Scyther only did 30 for 3 energy. So you could tell at this point, cards were starting to get quite a bit stronger. Sneasel was still kind of kept in check by 60 hit points, but overall this is one of the strongest cards of the era by far. Evolution cards got a boost as well. You have cards like Typhlosion, which have some solid attacks, along with, just a good Pokemon power and solid hit points. A card like Feraligatr, which would become very, very popular, had the attack Riptide that would be able to really just do as much damage as you wanted as long as you got enough water energy in your discard pile. So you could see they were making a clear effort to make these evolution cards much stronger as well. The one thing that changed it all was the little baby Pokemon Cleffa that allowed you to shuffle your hand into your deck and draw 7 cards. In the past, the game was overrun by super strong trainer cards that really stripped you of your hand, so you couldn't really do much, and that's why the basic Pokemon like Hitmonchan and such were so powerful. But Cleffa, he gave you a new hand. It was a little guy, only 30 hit points, but it had the baby rule. Now this forced your opponent to flip a coin every time they wanted to attack it. If it was tails, it did nothing. So Cleffa slowed the game down considerably, and this is where we started to kind of take a step back, and the game shifted more towards the evolution cards. If you want more examples of cards that got a lot stronger, take a look at like Magcargo, which could really hit high levels of damage with Lava Flow if you discarded enough energy. So it was apparent at this time that they were making cards much stronger. Now, at the same time, some of the cards were still so weak that they were a joke. So, if you take a look at like Dark Ampharos, which is a Stage 2 Pokemon, has 70 hit points and does 50 damage maximum. So, these cards, they were still kind of on par with the first ones, but they were starting to kind of get up there with their power level. Also a card like Dark Slowking, which would have 60 hit points on an evolution. It's not really going to cut it in competitive play. So you can see some of the cards are starting to push the limit here with how strong they're getting. But overall, cards were still kind of on the same level. It wasn't until Generation 3 that things started to take off, and that's what we'll take a look at next. In 2003, Nintendo took over the game from Wizards of the Coast, and you could tell just by the way cards were changing. In the Ruby and Sapphire set, a brand new mechanic of cards came out called EX Pokemon. Now these were generally stronger than your normal Pokemon. The drawback was that when they get knocked out, your opponent takes 2 prizes instead of 1. So, the first batch of them we had were actually not that powerful. Overall, Mewtwo EX was by far the strongest one, hitting for 60 damage for 3 energy, which was a big improvement over the previous cards we had. But it still wasn't strong enough to really make it worthwhile. The hit points weren't high enough, The attack didn't do enough. It just wasn't enough to change the game that much. But that'll change when the next set came out, Sandstorm. This one contained cards like Gardevoir EX that would have upwards of 150 hit points and do tons of damage, and there's no turning back at this point. In the past, Pokemon maxed out at 120 hit points, and it wasn't until this set that they finally surpassed that mark. Cards like Wailord EX definitely shattered that barrier by hitting 200 hit points, which is just a ridiculous amount. Cards like Rayquaza EX just did insane amounts of damage with the Dragon Burst attack. There's really no limit to what you could do. 40 damage for each energy you discard. This thing could knock out really every Pokemon in existence. So EXs, they started to really just dominate the game, and what can compete with these monstrous Pokemon that just have so much HP and do so much damage? Well, they started to make normal Pokemon stronger too. Cards like Nidoqueen would be good for its Power Lariat attack, that could really compete with any EX Pokemon. Then just take a look at cards like Dark Tyranitar, which actually have 3 attacks, and all of them are pretty devastating in their own right. So they started making the normal cards a lot stronger too, because, you know, we need something to keep with the EX Pokemon. Otherwise, those are just going to be way too dominant, and the game's going to get stale. The biggest evidence we have of the power creep in this era is just compare Dark Ampharos, the old one, to Dark Ampharos from Team Rocket Returns. Now this is just a few sets apart. This Dark Ampharos has 70 hit points, this one has 120. So you can see just how far cards have come in this short period of time once Nintendo took over the game. Cards like Dark Slowking as well, where the first one was very weak, the newest one was really strong. Cards like Lugia EX did 200 damage for 3 energy. Now granted, you have to discard all of them, but 200 damage is ridiculous. Just look at the Charizard EX as well. That also did 200 damage. The fact that these absurd numbers existed just kind of told the story for itself. Cards were getting stronger and stronger, and this is really what opened the floodgates. There was no turning back at this point. These new cards, they blow the old ones out of the water. So you have to either make your future ones weaker to try to even things out, and then ignore the fact that we have these superpower cards for a while, or you have to keep making cards stronger and stronger to keep up with the monster that you've unleashed. So Generation 3, this is definitely what tipped the scales and what started us on our path to power creep. When Generation 4 came out in 2007, things really started to spiral out of control. The first cards that really made an impact were just things like Empoleon that had massive amounts of hit points and did pretty big amounts of damage too. The poster boy for power creep definitely was Infernape though. For just 2 fire energy, you do 90 damage, and you pretty much just blast something in the face. And if that weren't enough, just straight up 90 for 2, you have a level X, a new mechanic, where you just basically just get to evolve again. This Infernape level X allows you to do 150 damage for the cost of 2 energy. Base set Charizard's rolling in his grave when he sees this one. This was just the height of the power creep. I mean, you could see just based on the past few sets, cards are starting to get stronger, but this is where it started to get a little far. The standard for high hit points had raised even more, as it seemed like it had every set, and that 120 hit point barrier that cards hit in the past is just gone forever. You know, just look at a card like Gallade here. With 130 hit points, it could do up to 180 damage for just 3 energy. Cards were starting to do more damage, and they had more hit points to go along with it. Look at Rhyperior level X, which has 170 hit points, or Torterra level X with 160. Cards were just getting ridiculous. And keep in mind, these are not even the EX Pokemon that we saw in the previous sets that gave up 2 prizes when they were knocked out. These cards only gave up 1 prize when they were knocked out, so they were just as strong without really the drawback. Cards like Kingdra were really just the definition of going too far. This thing can do 60 damage for 1 energy and 20 damage to a bench Pokemon. When you look back at the beginning, Hitmonchan did 20 damage for 1, and that was considered very good. Now we have Kingdra doing 60 plus 20 for 1. Where did we go wrong? It's hard to pinpoint where exactly this power creep hit so hard, but these cards are clearly an example of what has happened over the years. Take a look at this Wailord. It has 200 hit points. You know, I showed you the Wailord EX already that had 200, but again, this is not an EX Pokemon. This is just a regular Stage 1 Pokemon with 200 hit points. Attacks started to get even more ridiculous as well, with cards like Machamp that had Takeout that would just knock out a basic Pokemon instantly with no drawback. Or if you were facing an evolution, it did 40 for 1. So you could just see how ridiculous these cards are getting. Then we have Gyarados, which can use Tail Revenge, which actually does 90 for 0 energy. You don't even have to pay to attack with this thing, and it does 90 damage and has 130 hit points. Again, where did we go wrong with this stuff? As more sets came out, the Platinum set was the big one. We introduced SP Pokemon, which brought us back to our basics. Cards like Dialga G Level X, which had 120 hit points, could compete with pretty much any evolution card out there. Garchomp C Level X was another big one that really dominated the game. And just take a look at cards like Rayquaza C Level X that can hit for 200 damage. This is a basic Pokemon that you just have to level up, and then you can do 200 damage. Isn't this getting a little ridiculous? As more and more sets came out, more mechanics got introduced as well, such as the Prime Pokemon, which were even stronger. You know, we had cards like Donphan Prime, which would do 60 damage for 1 energy, have 120 hit points, and it's just a Stage 1. We would have Magnezone Prime, which does 50 damage for each energy you put into the Lost Zone, which is pretty much just removed from the game. So your damage barrier, it's not really there anymore. Magnezone can just pretty much do whatever he wants. And you can see the standard at this point for hit points has crawled up to 140 for Stage 2 Pokemon, where just a few sets ago, the standard was 130, and before that, it was 120, it was lower, but it just kept going up. Tyranitar Prime here has 160 hit points with no drawbacks. It's just a Stage 2 Pokemon. No EX, no hoops to jump through to get him out there. He's just that big. There's also another mechanic called the Legend Pokemon that you had to have 2 halves and you had to have them at the same time. Cards like Lugia Legend here could also do 200 damage. And then there were other cards that combined 2 different Pokemon that were much like the EX Pokemon from before, that when they get knocked out, they give up 2 prizes. But, you know, they were just so strong that it was still worth it. So Generation 4, this is the clearest example of when things went wrong. And it's just weird to think that 2 generations ago, we still had cards like that Dark Ampharos with 70 hit points. How far things have come. So here we are now today, with Generation 5 Black and White. The poster boy for this generation, well, both of them are Reshiram and Zekrom. Let's take a look at Reshiram first. This basic Pokemon has 130 hit points, so you can put it directly into play. And for 3 energy, it does 120 damage. Zekrom, very similar. 130 hit point, basic Pokemon. 120 damage for 3 energy. What happened? This is just too much. You know, when evolutions got to this point, sure, you can understand. It takes cards, it takes time to get your evolution Pokemon into play. It takes no time at all to put down a Reshiram. There's no drawback to it. It's not fair. So these cards really just started to set the trend where we needed to keep making things stronger and stronger because the old cards, they can't keep up anymore. Every generation, they would just introduce new cards that the old ones couldn't keep up with. So they just keep making stronger and stronger cards. Another example is Kyurem, which also has 130 hit points. It has an attack Glaciate that does 30 damage to each of your opponent's Pokemon. So it just doesn't hit one, it can hit all 6 if you have 6 out there. And they all have the same Outrage attack, which hits back harder if you hurt them. So these cards just got absurd, and I really don't know what happened or what possessed the creators of the game to do this. But that's where we are. Cards like Terrakion as well also have 130 hit points. This one can do 90 damage for 2 energy, one of the strongest Pokemon we have right now. But these were not the things that spun the game out of control. These actually still made the game okay. Old cards can still compete with these. It wasn't until the EXs came back that things really started to get out of control. Look at Mewtwo EX. This was really the card that changed it all. 170 hit points on a basic Pokemon. X-Ball really has no damage ceiling, and it can just be as fast as any other Pokemon, and it's going to be stronger than the other ones too. This card was so strong that it turned games into just both players using Mewtwo EX to kill each other with their Mewtwo's, since it's weak to Psychic. After that, we had Darkrai EX to kind of keep the Mewtwo in check, which has 180 hit points, and for 3 energy it does 90 to the active Pokemon and 30 to a bench Pokemon. Once again, cards just being just as ridiculous. And then the most recent one would be Rayquaza EX, which is modeled after the old Rayquaza EX we had in the EX Dragon set, which was a good card in its own right. And now this one has 70 more hit points and does 20 more damage for each energy you discard. So just taking a look at that. Rayquaza EX from Dragon. One of the most dominant cards of its era. Now, this Rayquaza EX blows that one out of the water. And it hasn't really been that long since it's been out. I mean, this just proves that old cards are just not compatible with the new ones anymore. Your new cards are going to destroy the old ones. And this is really the definition of what happened. Cards like Mewtwo, Darkrai, Rayquaza, they are head and shoulders above the rest, and they are just basic Pokemon. This is why people complain about Pokemon cards being too powerful nowadays. Just everything gets stronger and stronger, and where do you stop? It gets so ridiculous that cards like Empoleon, with 140 hit points, that can do up to 120 damage for 1 energy, are not even very good. If you had this back in the base set days, you would play this all the time because it had so much HP and did so much damage that even if you played Lightning Pokemon, they wouldn't be able to stand up to it because Empoleon would just overpower it for 1 energy. And nowadays, it's a tier 2 deck maybe? It's not even as strong as the basic Pokemon we have. So that just kind of shows you where we've come at this point. And it makes you wonder, what can they do next? How can they make these cards even more powerful? And will it ever stop? Have we reached a point where they realized how ridiculous it is? Or are cards going to keep getting more powerful? I guess we'll find out soon. You know, as cards like Landorus EX are coming out. Doesn't look like things are changing anytime soon. But hopefully things get a little nerfed in the future. And we start to get back to the basics. Well, not basics literally, because really the only things you can use right now are basic Pokemon. But back to the simpler things. The Hitmonchans, the Electabuzz, even the Wigglytuff. Where did we go wrong, guys? I don't know, but thanks for joining me on this trip down memory lane, where we can see how Pokemon cards have evolved over the years. Pokemon should be around for a while. It's already been 14 years, believe it or not. But we'll see what happens in the future. I'm Pooka. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you the next time.